The inspector condemned his tractor. He rebuilt it overnight and plowed 120 acres. The notice was tacked to the barn door with a single roofing nail. That was the first problem. The wind had come up overnight on the plains east of Sterling, Colorado, and by the time Wendell Krause walked out at 5:40 in the morning of April 8, 1981, the yellow paper was flapping sideways against the weathered wood. He pulled it down with his good hand. Read it under the bare bulb hanging from the eave. Read it again. Then he folded it into quarters and put it in the breast pocket of his coveralls. The paper said his tractor was condemned. Wendell Krause was 63 years old that spring, had been working the same 340 acres of dryland wheat ground in Logan County since 1940 when he came home from Italy with a piece of German metal still lodged behind his right shoulder blade. The doctors had told him to leave it. Said removal would do more damage than the metal itself. He had farmed for 34 years with that fragment grinding against bone every time he turned a wrench. Didn't think about it much anymore. His hands had thickened over the decades, knuckles wide as walnuts, fingernails permanently rimmed in dark grease that no soap could lift. The right thumb wouldn't straighten all the way after a baler accident in 1967. He could still tie a square knot with one hand. Could still feel the difference between a 1/4-20 thread and a 1/4-28 by running a bolt across his palm. The tractor was a 1953 John Deere Model 60, 2-cylinder. Gasoline, he had bought it used in 1958 from a widow over in Yuma County for $1,400. Hadn't owned another tractor since. The Model 60 had pulled his plow, his disc, his drill, his harrow, and his combine through 23 wheat crops and counting. Engine had been rebuilt twice. Transmission once. Wendell knew every bolt on that machine by touch. The county agricultural inspector had come through 3 days earlier, Tuesday afternoon. Spent maybe 11 minutes walking the equipment yard. The man's name was Roland Voss, 31 years old. Hired out of Fort Collins the previous October. He carried a clipboard with carbon paper forms and a tire gauge. He wore brown slacks and a tan shirt with the county seal sewn above the pocket. Polished brown loafers. Wendell had noticed the loafers when Voss got out of the pickup. Loafers on a farm in April. The ground was soft from snowmelt. Voss had walked on his toes for the first 30 feet, trying to keep mud off the leather. Eventually, he gave up. Voss had marked 4 items on the inspection sheet that Tuesday. The Model 60 was the last one. He had handed Wendell a yellow carbon copy without making eye contact and said the original would be mailed. The original arrived Saturday in the form of the notice nailed to the barn. The notice gave Wendell 14 days to remove the tractor from active service. The reasons were typed in small letters. Brake system non-compliant with current safety standards. Rollover protection structure absent. Hydraulic seals exhibiting visible weep. Exhaust system corroded beyond serviceable tolerance. Each violation carried a code number from a regulation handbook Wendell had never seen. The bottom of the form noted that continued use would result in forfeiture of the county's spring planting subsidy. That subsidy was $2,180. Wendell had already counted on it. He went back inside and put the kettle on the stove. His wife Mavis was still in bed. She had been sleeping later since the surgery in February. Wendell didn't wake her. He sat at the kitchen table in the gray light coming through the east window and read the notice for the 4th time. The fields needed to be worked starting Monday, 5 days away. The almanac was calling for rain by Thursday of the following week, and after that the ground would be too wet to brake for another 2 weeks. He had a window. He'd had it figured for a month. The Model 60 was the only tractor on the place. He had sold his backup, a 1962 Massey Ferguson, in 1978 to pay for a new well casing. Hadn't replaced it. Hadn't needed to. The Model 60 had never failed him through any planting or harvest in 23 years. 2 cylinders. Reliable as gravity. By 6:15 that morning, Wendell had walked the half-mile of gravel to his nearest neighbor's place. Carl Brubaker. Carl was 58. Farmed 480 acres on the south side of the section road. Carl read the notice without saying anything for a full minute. Then he handed it back. Carl said he'd heard about Voss. 2 other farmers in the eastern half of the county had received similar notices that month. One was Earl Tishanor, who farmed 200 acres near Iliff. The other was a man named Bob Ruzicka, over by Crook. Both had old equipment. Both had been told to remove machines from service. Earl had complied. Bought a used 1971 Ford 4000 from a dealer in Greeley for $4,800 he didn't really have. Ruzicka was still fighting it. Had hired a lawyer. Wendell asked Carl what he thought. Carl said the lawyer route would take months. The compliance route would take money Wendell didn't have. Said he didn't see a third option. Wendell walked back to his own place by 7:20. Ate 2 pieces of toast standing at the counter. Drank black coffee. Looked at the Model 60 sitting in the open shed where he'd parked it the previous October. The green paint had faded to the color of dried sage. The tires were 6 years old. The exhaust pipe did have rust on it, where the inspector had noted. So did everything else made of steel in Logan County. He looked at the notice one more time. Read the 4 violations. Then he walked into the machine shop attached to the back of the shed and turned on the overhead lights. The shop was 24 feet by 36 feet. Concrete floor. A bench along the north wall with 2 vises bolted to it, 1 mechanical and 1 hydraulic. A drill press from 1962. A small forge he'd built himself in 1971 from a 55-gallon drum and a salvaged blower. Welder in the corner, a Lincoln Act 225 he'd bought new in 1965. Rod stock standing in a milk can. Steel plate stacked under the bench. Pipe in lengths up to 8 feet, leaning against the south wall. Wendell had everything he needed. He took the notice out of his pocket and pinned it to a piece of corkboard above the bench. Then he went to the parts shelf and started pulling what he'd need. The brake system was the first item. The Model 60 used a band brake on each rear axle. Wendell knew the original design. He'd rebuilt those brakes himself in 1973. The current safety standard required a sealed disc system, but the regulation as Voss had cited it specified only that brakes must produce stopping force adequate to hold the tractor on a 15% grade with full load. Wendell pulled his copy of the 1953 John Deere service manual off the shelf. Looked up the band brake specs. The original bands produced 240 foot-pounds of holding torque per side. The 15% grade requirement, by his calculation, needed about 180 foot-pounds. The brakes were already compliant by performance, not by design. He went outside and put the tractor on jack stands. The rear wheels came off in 40 minutes. The brake drums came off in another 25. He inspected the bands. They were worn to half their original thickness. He'd been planning to replace them in May. He had a new set of bands sitting on the parts shelf, ordered the previous September from a salvage yard in Nebraska that specialized in old Deere parts. Cost $48 for the pair. By 9:30, he was reinstalling the drums with fresh bands. By 10:15, the wheels were back on. He tested the brakes by chalking the front tires and trying to roll the tractor down the slight grade out of the shed. It didn't move. He moved the chocks. Tried it again. Still didn't move. 1 violation down. Mavis came out at 10:30 with coffee and a thermos. She had read the notice on the kitchen table. She asked Wendell what he was doing. He told her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked if he needed any help. He said not yet. The rollover protection structure was the next item. The Model 60 had been built before ROPS was even an industry concept. There was no factory option. There was no aftermarket kit available for that model year that Wendell knew about. He would have to build one. He went back into the shop and started sketching on the back of a feed company calendar. The structure needed to extend at least 42 inches above the seat. It needed to withstand a side impact load equal to twice the tractor's weight. The Model 60 weighed 3,840 pounds dry. That meant the ROPS needed to handle 7,680 pounds of lateral force without deforming past the operator zone. Wendell had done structural calculations during the war for portable bridge supports. The principles were the same. Triangulation, minimum material thickness. He selected 2-inch square steel tubing with 1/4-inch wall thickness. He had 18 feet of it on hand, left over from a corral project in 1978. He measured the seat platform, cut the tubing to length with a chop saw. 4 uprights, 2 crossbars, 2 diagonal braces. The frame would bolt directly to the rear axle housing, using brackets he would fabricate from 1/4-inch plate. The cutting took 35 minutes. The welding took 2 hours and 10 minutes. He stopped at noon for a sandwich, ate it standing in the shop, looking at the partial ROPS frame laid out on sawhorses. He had welded the 4 uprights to a U-shaped base. The next step was the upper crossbar and the diagonals. He went back to work at 12:25. By 2:40, the frame was complete. He fabricated the mounting brackets in another hour, drilled the holes with the drill press, using a 1/2-inch bit and cutting oil he kept in an old motor oil container. The brackets bolted to the rear axle housing using grade 8 fasteners he had stored in coffee cans on a shelf. He had hundreds of bolts in those cans, sorted by size, labeled in his own handwriting with a grease pen. The welding arc had left dark spots floating in his vision by mid-afternoon. He blinked through them, took a 5-minute break around 3:30 to rinse his eyes with water from the shop tap. The Lincoln welder ran hot when he pushed it. He kept the duty cycles short. 2 minutes welding, 3 minutes off. The transformer hummed steadily through both phases. The ROPS frame was on the tractor by 4:15. He tested it by attaching a chain to the top crossbar and pulling laterally with a come-along anchored to the shop wall. He had no way to apply 7,680 pounds of force, but he could apply enough to detect any flex. He pulled the come-along until the chain was singing tight. The frame didn't move. He checked the welds with a magnifying glass. No deformation at the joints. 2 violations down. The hydraulic seals were the third item. The Model 60 had a single hydraulic remote that operated through a piston pump driven off the crankshaft. The seals were leather. Original design from 1953. They were weeping at the cylinder rod, which is what the inspector had noted. Wendell had replaced those seals once before, in 1969. He had ordered modern composite replacements from the same Nebraska salvage yard in February, expecting to install them during summer downtime. Cost: $22 for the seal kit. He drained the hydraulic reservoir into a clean 5-gallon bucket, disassembled the piston pump. The interior was clean. The cylinder bore was within specification. He installed the new seals using a wooden mandrel he turned on his lathe in 1972 specifically for this purpose. Reassembled the pump. Refilled the reservoir with fresh hydraulic fluid he kept in a 55-gallon drum. The job took an hour and 40 minutes. Finished at 6:35 in the evening. Mavis brought supper to the shop. Beef and noodles in a Pyrex dish. He ate at the workbench with the dish balanced on a flat piece of steel. She sat on the wooden stool across from him and read the violations list out loud. She asked about the last item. the exhaust. Wendell said he had a plan for it. The exhaust system on the Model 60 was a vertical pipe coming up from the manifold, running past the operator's right side, and topped with a rain cap. The original muffler was internal to the pipe section. The pipe was rusted through in 2 places, just like Voss had noted. Wendell could have welded patches. He could have replaced just the rusted sections, but the inspector had specified corroded beyond serviceable tolerance, and patching would still leave 28 years of corrosion in the rest of the pipe. He decided to fabricate an entirely new exhaust system. He had 3-inch black pipe on the rack. Schedule 40. Wall thickness .216 inches. New. He had bought it in 1979 for a project that never happened. He measured the existing exhaust, cut 3 sections from the black pipe using a hacksaw, then cleaned the cuts with a flap disc on his grinder. He welded the sections into the same configuration as the original, including the integrated muffler chamber, which he formed by expanding a section of pipe over a steel cone he'd made years before. The muffler chamber needed internal baffles he cut 4 baffle plates from 14-gauge sheet steel, stamped a 1-inch hole through the center of each one using a hand punch, welded the baffles into the chamber at staggered angles, alternating offset, so exhaust gases would have to bend 4 times before exiting. The design was something he had seen on a generator at a road construction site in 1961. He had stored the principle in his memory for 20 years, without ever using it. The new exhaust took until 9:15 that night. When it was installed and the tractor was lowered off the jack stands, Wendell started the engine for the first time since October. The Model 60 fired on the 2nd compression stroke. The new exhaust changed the sound. Deeper, cleaner, the smoke that came out of the rain cap was light gray and steady. He let it run for 10 minutes. Watch oil pressure, 42 psi at idle. Temperature climbing normally. No leaks at the hydraulic remote. No leaks at the brake drums. The ROPS frame stood square against the night sky over the equipment yard. He shut the tractor off at 9:30. Walked back to the house. Sat at the kitchen table while Mavis made him a fresh cup of coffee. He read the notice. Then he turned it over and started writing on the back, in pencil, exactly what he had done to address each violation. He wrote out the brake torque calculations, the ROPS material specifications, the hydraulic seal part numbers, the exhaust pipe schedule rating. He listed every measurement, every part, every weld. 3 pages of notes in his careful block printing. He finished at 10:45. Went to bed. Monday morning he hooked the 4-bottom plow to the Model 60 and drove into the south field. The ground was at perfect moisture. He plowed from 6 double in the morning until 7:30 at night with a 30-minute break for dinner. Covered 32 acres the first day. Tuesday he covered 38. Wednesday 41. Thursday 42. By Thursday evening, he had plowed 153 acres. The rain came Friday afternoon, just like the almanac said it would. Wendell had finished his entire south section, 120 acres, plus another 33 acres of the east section he hadn't even planned to plow until the following week. The Model 60 had not skipped 1 compression cycle in 4 days. The ROPS frame caught the wind across the open ground, but didn't hum or vibrate at any speed Wendell tried. He had welded it solid enough that the whole assembly moved as one piece. The new exhaust threw a thin column of pale smoke straight up when he was idling at the end of a row. Mavis brought thermos coffee and sandwiches to the field twice a day. She would stand at the fence line watching him turn at the corners. He always lifted one hand off the wheel and held it palm out toward her. She would do the same back. Then she would walk the half-mile to the house. Carl Brubaker drove past the south field on Wednesday afternoon, stopped his truck on the section road, watched Wendell plow for maybe 10 minutes from the running board, didn't honk, didn't wave, just watched. drove on. Roland Voss came back to the farm on the following Tuesday, April 21st. 13 days after the original notice. He drove up in his county pickup at 10:15 in the morning. Carl Brubaker happened to be at the place borrowing a section of harrow, and the two men were standing by the equipment shed when Voss pulled in. Voss got out with his clipboard. He looked at the Model 60, the new ROPS frame, the fresh exhaust pipe, the hydraulic lines without any weep. He walked around the tractor twice. He asked Wendell what he had done. Wendell handed him the 3 pages of pencil notes he'd written the previous Wednesday night. Voss read them standing there in the yard. The wind was up again. He had to hold the pages flat against the clipboard with his thumb. He read for a long time. Then he asked Wendell who had certified the welds. Wendell said he had certified them himself. By visual inspection, he explained that he had been welding since 1944, when the Army had trained him for field repair of light vehicles in North Africa. He had welded structural steel on the construction of Highway 76 between 1958 and 1960. He had certified inspections under American Welding Society Standard D1.1 during that period. His certification had lapsed in 1962, but the underlying skill had not. Voss said the welds would need to be inspected by a certified third party. Wendell said that would be fine. The certified inspector came out the following week from a structural firm in Fort Morgan. His name was Donald Krieger. He charged $185 for the inspection. He spent 2 hours on the Model 60 with a dye-penetrant test kit and an ultrasonic thick. He found no defects in any of Wendell's welds. He passed every joint. He took photographs of the ROPS frame for his own files, asked Wendell if he would consider building similar frames for other clients of his firm. Said he had 3 farmers within 20 miles who needed exactly this kind of fabrication done. Wendell said he wasn't really in the fabrication business. Krieger stood there in the yard for another minute looking at the tractor. He asked where Wendell had learned to weld structural steel. Wendell told him about the Army and the highway project. Krieger said his father had worked on Highway 76 too, as a flagman in 1959. Wendell remembered one in particular who used to bring coffee to the welders before sunrise. Krieger's eyes changed. He said that sounded like his father. They didn't talk about it longer than that. Krieger packed up his test kit, drove away. Krieger filed his report with the county on May 4th. The condemnation notice was rescinded on May 6th. The $2,180 planting subsidy was approved on May 11th. Wendell deposited the check the same day at the First National Bank of Sterling. Roland Voss did not return to the Kraus farm. 2 months later, Voss was transferred to a desk position in the Fort Collins regional office. The official reason given was a restructuring of inspection territories. The unofficial reason, which Carl Brubaker heard from a cousin who worked at the county courthouse, was that 3 farmers had filed complaints about Voss's inspection methodology, and one of those complaints had included the words "fabricated his own ROPS in 19 hours. Bob Rusica over by Crook eventually won his case. Cost him $3,400 in legal fees. Earl Tichenor, who had bought the 1971 Ford 4000 to comply, lost the engine in 1983 and had to replace it. The whole tractor sat in his shed by 1986. He went back to renting equipment from a neighbor. Wendell Kraus farmed his 340 acres with the Model 60 for another 9 years, retired in 1990 at the age of 72. The tractor went with the farm when he sold it to a young couple from Greeley who wanted to raise organic wheat. The young husband, whose name was Tom Hadley, asked Wendell about the ROPS frame. Said he'd never seen one like it on an old Deere. Wendell told him the story. All of it. The notice on the barn door. The 19 hours in the shop. The 4 violations. the certified inspector from Fort Morgan, the transferred bureaucrat. Tom Hadley kept the Model 60, kept the ROPS frame. The tractor was still working the same ground in 2004 when Wendell drove past one last time on his way to a funeral in Yuma. He saw the Model 60 sitting in the equipment yard with the harrow attached. The green paint was still faded. The ROPS frame still stood square. The new exhaust pipe Wendell had bent and welded in April of 1981 was still carrying gray smoke into the eastern Colorado sky. He didn't stop. Didn't need to. The condemnation notice was still folded in a drawer in the kitchen of the farmhouse Wendell had moved to in Sterling. 3 pages of pencil notes were still clipped to the back of it. The roofing nail that had pinned it to the barn door was still in the can of nails in his garage, where he had dropped it the morning of April 8, 1981. The tractor outlived the rule that condemned it. Still plowing, still running. Still just 2 cylinders and a man who knew what he was doing.